Hello, welcome to your first government video. This will be the first in a series of videos about chapters 1 and 2. So let's go ahead and get started. This unit is called Foundations and Formations of Government, and this is where we're going to look at how government came to be and look at some examples upon which American government is based upon. So our essential questions for this unit: why do we need government? How do different types of economies operate? What Enlightenment philosophical ideas are the foundation of American government? How can characteristics of American democracy be seen throughout history? How have documents such as the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration of Independence shaped American government? What British examples is American government based upon? How do different types and systems of government operate? And how did British actions eventually lead to the American Revolution? So the essential question that we want to focus on with today's video is, why do we need government? Now, you can feel however you want to feel about our government right now. You can be in favor of what President Obama does, you can be wholeheartedly against it, whatever. But the idea of government that I want you to focus on today is not a physical government, okay? It's this abstract idea that there's something out there that governs or controls us. So before we get to that, we want to look at some important terms. The first is state. Now, this is a term that you've used since you were like in kindergarten. When you talk about one of the states in the United States of America, you're talking about Missouri or Illinois, whatever. But in our class, this term state is not going to refer to a state within the United States. It's actually going to refer to what you think of as a country. So a state, and I would write this down, a state has three characteristics. First of all, it occupies a definite territory. So basically, you can find it on a map. The second thing it does is it has an organized government. And then it also has the power to make and enforce laws without the consent of a higher authority. You may want to pause and rewind so you can get all of that stuff. So by that definition, a state is not Missouri. A state would be the United States. Why is Missouri not a state? Because it doesn't have the authority to make laws without a higher authority. So like if Missouri wanted to make a law that said it was illegal to practice whatever religion you wanted to, you couldn't do that because that's against the United States Constitution. So by this definition, Missouri is not a state, but the United States would be. The second term here is nation. Now, whenever we say the Pledge of Allegiance, we say one nation under God. That term nation in the pledge refers to our country. But the term nation, as we're going to use it in our class, is actually not going to define a country. It's going to define, I would get ready to jot this down, a group of people that share common bonds of race, religion, language, and culture. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow in class. This next one here, nation state, I just want you to go ahead and scratch that off. We're not going to worry about that one. Then you have a consensus. This is also a term that we're going to use a lot in this class. A consensus is when you have the agreement of most people. Sovereignty, that term sovereignty means that you have the sole or absolute power. And then last but not least is government. And we're going to talk in just a second about what government does. So, have you ever sat down and thought about how exactly we ended up with government? I'm sure you all have. You don't have to lie. How did we end up with government? How did we get this institution that controls us? Well, there are four main theories that political scientists and historians use whenever they talk about the origin of government. The first one is the evolutionary theory. Now, I'm not talking about how people came from monkeys or anything like that. When we're talking about the evolutionary theory of government, we mean that government evolved from something. So imagine this, there's a huge family, you're wandering through the desert. All of a sudden somebody says, hey, I think we should go that way because there's food and water over there. And everybody says, okay, sounds good. That person has taken on the role of the government in that situation. So, for example, your textbook talks about the biblical story of Moses. Moses took on the role of the government because he led people to a certain place. Next is the force theory, and as you can probably imagine, the force theory tells us that government came to be when someone controlled a group of people by force. So think about like a crazy dictator that rolls into a country and says, okay, we are now in charge of you. That person has taken control through force. And then you've got the divine right theory, and this is probably something you talked about in world history last year. The divine right theory tells us that a person believes that they have the power to govern based on permission given to them by a god or a group of gods. Okay, so divine, that term divine meaning godly or all-powerful. The social contract theory is probably one of my favorites to talk about, and I'm going to spend some time discussing this with you in class tomorrow. But the social contract theory tells us that we have to give up some of our rights in order to receive protection from the government. Okay, so I give up my right to drive 90 miles an hour down Highway 67 because it's going to endanger everyone else. So I give up that right to receive protection. It's okay if I drive 90 miles an hour down Highway 67, but when all of you start doing the same thing, that's when it gets crazy. So the social contract theory, two guys talked about the social contract theory in their writings. The first one was Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes said that people entered into this social contract with their government to receive protection because he thought in a time when government didn't exist, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And he called that time where government didn't exist a state of nature. So I want you to pause me and rewind and jot that down. Thomas Hobbes. The next guy, John Locke, is an Englishman that we get a lot of our American concepts of government from. So he wrote a couple of different things. One of them was the two Treatises of Government. John Locke actually believed that people gave up some of their rights to receive protection from the government as well, but he thought that there was a time when people had to break the social contract. And that time was if the government stopped working for the people. Like if the government turned on the people, if the federal government started rolling into our town with tanks and dropping missiles on us and stuff like that, then that would be a time that we would have to break the social contract. Now, pause me for a second and think about what would happen if we broke the social contract. According to John Locke, if the people break the social contract, they still have to create a new government. So it's not like we just break the social contract and we run around like crazy people. In order for people to survive and thrive, we have to have this governing body. Now, Thomas Hobbes disagreed with John Locke on that one thing. He said that once the government is in place, it has to remain in place. There is never a time when you should break the social contract. So you can kind of see where we as Americans who broke away from Great Britain side a little more with John Locke. Now, John Locke also talked about this theory of natural rights, and some of these are going to sound kind of familiar. John Locke believed that everybody, no matter who you were born with three rights: life, liberty, and property. You had the right to be alive, you had the right to be free, and you had the right to own stuff. Okay? And we'll talk about that in our activity tomorrow as well. But jumping back to why we need government, what does government do for us? You may say, yeah, they tax us and they don't let us do stuff and, whatever. But government really serves four main purposes, and I want you to make sure that you jot these down. Government is responsible for maintaining social order, meaning that they resolve conflicts, which is kind of what's happening as the National Guard is being called into Ferguson. They're trying to resolve a conflict. The second thing that government does is to provide public services. So an example of a public service would be like a public school, would be creating roads and bridges, things that have to be in place in order for people to be able to function. Also, making and enforcing laws that keep us safe. That's an example of a public service. The third thing that government does is to provide national security, and that kind of really doesn't need a really big description. To provide national security means to protect us from outside invasions, and sometimes foreign invasions as well. Then we've also got the authority to make economic decisions. So the government makes decisions on how, like our tax rate. If the economy is stale like it was a few years ago, the government can say, okay, we're going to borrow a whole bunch of money and we're going to distribute it to the people so they can spend it and stimulate the economy. So tomorrow we're going to discuss this concept of what government does and the state of nature in an activity, but please make sure that you have completed the Google Doc that's attached to this activity or this video. Make sure that you've submitted it, and if you have any questions, please ask in class. See ya.